3 real-life haunted house. It was supposed to be their dream house. The moment they stepped inside, the creaking floorboards seemed to welcome them. The place had a charm, old but well-kept. Still, there was something about the air, thick, heavy, almost suffocating. At night, the house whispered. It wasn't the wind. No, this was different. A sound that crawled across the walls. A low, hushed murmur. They'd brush it off. But then, things started moving on their own. A mug sliding across the counter. A chair scraping against the floor when no one was there. And that mirror, the one in the hallway. It never felt right. When they stood before it, they could almost see another face staring back. Not quite their own. The wife, Claire, couldn't ignore it. Her gut told her something was wrong. One night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow. Her heart pounded. The house was silent. Still, at 3 a.m., she pulled the covers tighter around her, tried to ignore it, but then she saw him, a shadow, tall and thin, standing in the doorway, frozen, her eyes locked with his. Or was it a shadow? It was so hard to tell. He didn't move, just stood there. She blinked, and it was gone. Her breath came in sharp gasps. The feeling lingered for days. She told her husband, Mark, but he dismissed it. He didn't believe in ghosts. But that night, when he was alone, he felt it too. A pressure on his chest. Like something was holding him down. He tried to call out, but no sound came. His throat closed up. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. Trapped. He fought to move. But something or someone was holding him in place. The air grew colder, until it was unbearable. Then silence. The door opened on its own. He stumbled out wide-eyed, heart racing. Mark never slept the same after that. The house, it had claimed them, but they never left. Because no one who moves into that house ever really does that. Horror stories that will shock you. Days turned into weeks, and the unease never left. The house felt like a prison. But it wasn't the walls that trapped them. It was the silence. The heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to throb with every heartbeat. They tried everything to ignore it. Renovations, new furniture, fresh paint, but nothing changed. One night, Claire heard whispers again. This time, they were clearer, closer, like someone was standing right beside her. But when she turned, no one was there. The voices spoke her name. Soft, calm. Claire. She froze. The air in the room shifted. Cold fingers brushed the back of her neck, a sensation that made her skin crawl. She ran to Mark, desperate. He was awake, sitting in the dark, staring at the wall, his eyes wide, unblinking. "Mark," she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, only nodded slowly. Something in his expression, so distant, so vacant, sent a chill down her spine. She shook him harder this time. His head jerked to the side, eyes snapping back into focus. But they weren't the same eyes. Not anymore. They were hollow, empty. "Claire," he whispered, his voice not his own. "It's too late." The house had claimed him too. Mark stood up, his movements jerky, unnatural. "Mark, please." Claire screamed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the hallway mirror. The same mirror they had always avoided. She followed, shaking, terrified. There, in the reflection, they both stood. But not as they were. The glass warped their figures. A twisted version of themselves, distorted by something darker. Claire's heart slammed in her chest. This wasn't them. This wasn't right. Before she could pull Mark away, something in the mirror shifted. A figure, a shadow. It moved toward them. A slow, deliberate step. The reflection was changing. Something dark, ancient, was crawling out of the glass. And in that moment, Claire understood. It wasn't just the house that haunted them. It was the mirror, the reflection, the thing that lived behind it. and it was waiting for them to cross that final line. That Claire's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the mirror. Her reflection, Mark's reflection, no longer resembled them at all. It was something else, a grotesque parody of their faces, warped by shadows and malice. The figure in the glass grinned, a wide, jagged smile that didn't belong. Her breath caught. Her mind screamed to run, but her legs were frozen, cemented to the floor. Mark, no, whatever it was, reached for the mirror, slowly, methodically. His fingers stretched out, grazing the glass with a cold, unnatural touch. The shadows deepened. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure in the mirror shifted. It was no longer behind the glass. It was right in front of her, right beside her. Mark, her husband, her love, was gone. All that was left was a hollow shell, standing lifeless before her. A thing wearing his face. It spoke, but it wasn't Mark's voice anymore. It was low, gravelly. "I've been waiting for you." Claire stumbled back, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She spun around, looking for an escape, but the house felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her every movement. The whispers came again. "Claire, come closer." Her heart pounded in her chest. Her body moved on its own, drawn toward the mirror. She reached out a trembling hand, unsure if she even had control anymore. But then she saw it, out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, a fleeting movement. Her daughter, Emma. "Mom, don't." Emma's voice cracked, filled with fear. Claire snapped her head around, her eyes wide with horror. But it was too late. The door to the hallway slammed shut. A figure, the figure appeared in front of Emma. It was tall, too tall, its body contorted in unnatural ways, like a creature born from darkness itself. Emma screamed, but no sound escaped. She was dragged back toward the mirror, pulled by something invisible. Claire's scream tore through the house. She ran forward, her heart breaking. But the thing, the reflection was already gone. Everything went black. The house grew quiet once more. Then, as if waking from a nightmare, Claire opened her eyes. But she wasn't in the house anymore. She was somewhere else. The mirror hung on the wall in front of her. And when she looked into it, she knew. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The house had claimed them all. And in the end, it always gets them. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She was no longer in the house. The air was thick, oppressive, yet strangely still. She stood in a vast, darkened room. No, not a room, It was more like a space that stretched on forever. The floor beneath her feet was cold, as though the warmth of the earth itself had been drained away. The walls, if there were any walls, seemed to shift and distort the longer she stared at them. Endless shadows seemed to move, like thick smoke curling around unseen corners. In front of her, the mirror stood, suspended in the darkness. The glass was no longer reflecting her. It didn't reflect anything at all. It was empty, but she felt the presence of something there watching her, waiting. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Claire reached forward, drawn toward the reflection. She didn't want to. She shouldn't. But her hand moved of its own accord, fingers trembling as they neared the cold surface. Suddenly, she heard a whisper, soft at first, then louder, until it felt as if the words were vibrating inside her skull. "You belong to us now, She pulled her hand back, heart hammering. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was inside her, gnawing at her thoughts, clawing at her mind. Then she saw it. The shadow moved in the reflection. It wasn't human anymore. It was something worse. A shape flickering, shifting, made of pure darkness. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the glass. And then it smiled. A horrible, contorted smile that stretched too wide for any human mouth. Asterisk, we are the house. Asterisk. It spoke again, its voice merging with the whispers, until they became a single, maddening chorus. Asterisk, we are the ones who wait. Asterisk. The room around Claire started to twist. The ground beneath her feet felt as if it was caving in. The darkness rose, crawling up her legs, clinging to her skin, pulling her deeper into the reflection. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. Her vision blurred. Then, through the shifting fog of shadows, she saw the faces. Emma, Mark, the neighbors, all of them, trapped in the mirror, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They were there, and yet they weren't. They were part of it now, part of the house, part of whatever it was that lived in the glass. Claire stumbled back, but the darkness was faster. It surged forward, swallowing her in an instant. And as the world around her folded into nothingness, she knew the house had won. The house had claimed them all. And now it was waiting for the next one to come. It always does. Waiting to drag them in. The darkness consumed her. It wasn't a cold, empty. Her body felt numb, detached. But still, her mind was wide awake. She could hear the whispers, no, voices, screaming, begging. Mark, Emma, the others. They were trapped, just like her. All of them lost, bound to the house, bound to the mirror. Claire tried to scream, but no sound came. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She could feel herself changing. The house had a way of doing that. It twisted them, molded them, broke them down, piece by piece, until they were no longer who they had been. And then, just as quickly, it rebuilt them into something else. She could feel her limbs, her face, her soul, warping. Her reflection in the mirror, if she could even still call it that, wasn't hers anymore. It was them, all of them, a twisted composite of their faces, their voices, their memories. The house didn't want just one. It wanted them all, together, forever. Suddenly, she was aware of something else. A presence, a dark, unholy force that hovered just beyond her sight. It didn't need to show itself. It was the house that had swallowed them whole, the house that had bled them dry. Claire's heart thudded in her chest as the realization hit her. She wasn't alone, not anymore, and she never would be again. She was part of it now, a part of the house, a part of the reflection, a part of the darkness, and it wasn't finished. The house was still hungry. It was always hungry. It was waiting for the next innocent soul to stumble in, the next family to walk through the door, to claim them. The endless cycle would continue. It always did. And in the cold, suffocating darkness, Claire's last thought was one she could never escape. They had never left. None of them ever did. The house owned them now. And when the next ones arrived, it would be ready. There was no light here, no escape, no way to tell how long had passed. Time itself seemed to lose all meaning in the dark abyss where Claire now existed. Her senses were dulled, as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched thin and wrapped around her in suffocating layers. But then, from somewhere deep within the void, a faint sound reached her. A creak, a groan, the faintest whisper of footsteps. Claire's heart fluttered. Was it real? Was it happening again? Could there still be someone else? She strained to listen, to feel, to grasp onto anything that could offer her a glimpse of hope. The whispers grew louder, clearer. A voice. No, voices. Her name. Asterisk Claire. Claire. Asterisk. It was a call from far off. It wasn't just hers, but a chorus. Asterisk familiar voices star. Her mind snapped back to the surface. It was them. Mark. Emma. They were still alive. But no, she knew better. There was no salvation here. There was no escape. The house had them, and now it wanted more. The faint voices grew frantic, pleading, but there was no urgency in them. They were part of the cycle now, part of the house, all of them, forever. Suddenly, the shadows moved. They crawled around her feet, grasping, pulling, lifting her. And for the first time since entering the house, Claire felt herself fall. She was pulled down into an endless, twisting spiral. And as she descended, she saw them, asterisk faces asterisk, asterisk dozens asterisk of them, flickering in and out of existence. They were all trapped here, suspended in time and space, writhing in their own dark prison. And as Claire's body twisted and stretched, her own face joined theirs. Her mind screamed, but no sound came. Her body contorted. Her features changed. And in that moment, Claire understood. She was no longer herself. She was no longer anyone. She was part of the house, part of the dark, unspeakable thing that lived inside the walls, in the mirrors, in the reflection. The endless hunger, the eternal waiting. And she realized too late that the house was always waiting for the next, always hungry, and the cycle would never end. The house would never be satisfied, not until it had claimed every soul. And then, when the next family came, it would begin again, that Claire's vision blurred, the shadows twisting around her as her mind fragmented into 1,000 pieces. Her senses dissolved, leaving only the raw, unyielding feeling of being consumed, absorbed, lost in the darkness that clung to every inch of her. Her form became shapeless, no longer human, no longer anything recognizable. She was one with the void, one with the house, and as she drifted deeper into its endless maw, she could hear it. The whispering voices, they weren't just hers. They were everyone's, everyone who had ever walked through the door. Asterisk we are, all of us. One now, asterisk. Their words echoed, reverberating through her fractured soul, filling the hollow space where her thoughts once lived. The house had consumed them. It had taken everything, every hope, every dream, every shred of life, and turned them into something else. Something that belonged only to the darkness. Something that would never leave. Somewhere, far away, a door creaked open. A faint sound of footsteps echoed down an empty hallway. The house stirred. It knew. It was waiting. Waiting for the next. And in that instant, Claire felt the familiar pull again. The sharp tug of reality. The desire to reach out. Her eyes snapped open, but this time, she was not her anymore. She was a whisper in the darkness. A shadow among shadows. The house had twisted her, had made her into something else. And as she floated in the abyss, her thoughts, asterisk their asterisk thoughts, melted together, fused into a single entity. She was no longer Claire. She was the house. She was the reflection. She was the darkness. And as the next footsteps grew closer, closer to the door, she felt the hunger grow again. The hunger for more. The hunger for them. A new family. New lives to twist, to claim, to drag into the depths. A new soul to break. A new reflection to distort. And she, asterisk they asterisk, would wait. Wait in the dark, whispering, beckoning. Until the next ones arrived. Until the house could feed again. And the cycle would continue. Forever. Always. Waiting. The door creaked open. Slow. Unhurried. A rush of cold air swept through the space, carrying with it the faintest scent of earth and dust. Footsteps. Hesitant. A new family. Unaware. The house stirred, as if awakening from a long slumber. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker. They stretched out, slithering across the floor, along the walls, reaching, beckoning. In the hallway, the soft murmur of voices could be heard. Too low to be understood, but unmistakably familiar. The house knew them, knew the sound of their fear before they even realized it. A young woman stepped forward, her face pale and uncertain as she surveyed the dimly lit corridor. Her eyes flitted nervously over the walls. A slight shiver ran through her as she stepped inside. She glanced at her partner, her hands clenched around the doorframe, as if she were fighting an invisible force. "Are you sure this is the place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The air felt wrong. He turned toward her, but before he could say a word, the temperature dropped. The walls creaked, and the mirror, positioned just at the end of the hall, shimmered. For a split second, the shadows swirled. They danced around the couple, and without warning, the air felt heavy, thick with an oppressive presence. The house was awake, and it was watching. The woman stepped forward, drawn to the mirror as if by some invisible force. Her hand reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the glass. She gasped, pulling her hand back, as if shocked by a sudden jolt of electricity. "Something's wrong here," she whispered, but the words seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the ever-growing darkness. Her partner turned to face her, his face drawn tight with worry. But it was too late. The house had already claimed them, just as it had claimed every soul before them. The shadows stretched and grew, swallowing them whole. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of the house, Claire, asterisk, or what was left of her asterisk, felt it. The familiar tug, the familiar hunger. It was beginning again. The house had found new prey. The cycle would repeat, and the voices in the dark whispered once more. Asterisk, we are waiting. Asterisk, the house was never finished. It would never be finished. It would always wait, always hunger. And as the new souls stepped deeper into the house, they too would become part of the reflection, part of the endless cycle, forever. And when the next family came, the house would be waiting for them too. The house breathed, and it waited. Its walls stretched and groaned. Its floors creaked with an ancient hunger. Time seemed to move in strange rhythms here, slowing, stopping, twisting upon itself. The new family wandered deeper into the house, unknowingly following the path laid out for them, the one that had ensnared every soul before them. The father, David, felt uneasy, though he tried to hide it. He kept reassuring his wife, Sophie, and their daughter, Lily, that everything would be fine, that this was just a new chapter in their lives, a fresh start. But the house had other plans. Each room they entered seemed to close in on them. The air grew thicker. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Lily, a bright-eyed 8-year-old, was the first to notice something strange. She stood at the end of a narrow hallway, staring at the mirror at the far end. "Mom, Dad, look!" Sophie and David turned, following Lily's gaze. There it was again, the same distorted reflection they had all seen, fleeting, almost imperceptible. A face, but not quite a face. Eyes that were too hollow, mouths that stretched too wide. Sophie shivered. "It's just a trick of the light," David muttered, though his voice held little conviction. He glanced away, but Sophie couldn't look away from the mirror. She felt something in the pit of her stomach, a deep, gnawing sense that they weren't alone. The air in the room grew colder. The shadows seemed to flicker and move around them. Suddenly, Lily reached out, her small hand touching the mirror. "No," Sophie shouted, rushing forward to pull her back. But it was too late. Lily's hand pressed against the glass with unnatural force, her small fingers sinking into it like soft clay. Her face twisted in confusion, and then a look of terror spread across her features. The glass warped. A sudden pull. It was as though the mirror itself reached back. And then, without warning, Lily was gone. Vanished. Sophie screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the house, as if the walls themselves were devouring her voice. David rushed to the mirror, frantically pushing his hands against it, trying to pull Lily back out. But it was useless. The house had claimed her. It always did. Sophie fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. And then, as if from 1,000 miles away, a voice whispered in the darkness. Asterisk, you belong to us now. Asterisk. David froze. Sophie turned slowly, her eyes wide with horror. The house had claimed them all. Lily, David, Sophie. And as the shadows crept closer, the family found themselves drawn toward the mirror, just as countless others had been before them. The same reflection, the same twisted faces. Lily was there now, but she wasn't quite Lily. Her eyes were hollow, her face stretched in a grotesque grin. They were all part of it now. The reflection was no longer a reflection at all. It was the house, and they were its new prisoners, forever. Somewhere deep inside the house, the cycle began again. Waiting, hunger. And when the next family arrived, it would be ready, the house breathed, its pulse slow, rhythmic, as the house had them now. And with each passing moment, their forms began to shift. It started subtly at first. Their movements grew slower, their eyes lost their focus, and their voices, once full of fear and disbelief, began to echo with a strange, hollow quality. They were changing. The mirror reflected them, but not as they had been. The house was rewriting them, distorting them into something new, something that fit its dark, hungry nature. David's features blurred. His eyes grew too wide, his skin too pale. He stood frozen, his arms stretched unnaturally at his sides, his mouth hanging open in a permanent, silent scream. Sophie, too, was consumed. Her once joyful face twisted into a grotesque mask. Her skin became translucent, thin as paper. She tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound came. She only stared at the reflection, at the others, at the house that was swallowing her whole. And Lily, poor Lily, her wide, innocent eyes no longer looked like those of a child. They were empty, voids that sucked in all light. Her small form was stretched, her limbs unnaturally long, like a marionette with broken strings. Her fingers twisted, curling into the glass, her smile widening far too much, her teeth sharp and unnatural. They were lost now. They were part of it. The house had rewritten their existence, absorbed them into its walls, its endless hunger. They were reflections, no longer human, no longer living. And the mirror, the one that had once shown their image, was no longer just a surface. It was a doorway, a portal, a gate to something darker. The house waited. It always waited. In the vast, empty halls of the house, the air thickened once more. The dark spaces between rooms seemed to breathe, sighing with anticipation. The next footsteps came. New blood, new souls to consume. A couple, unaware of what awaited them. They had found the house, drawn to it by curiosity or by some unknown force. It didn't matter. The house would always find its next victims. The door creaked open. A man stepped inside, his gaze flicking nervously around the dark, oppressive entryway. His wife followed closely behind, clutching his arm. "This doesn't feel right," the woman whispered, her voice tight with unease. He nodded but didn't speak. Something in the house was watching them. They stepped further inside, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Then they saw it. The mirror. It stood at the far end of the hallway, its surface gleaming faintly, beckoning them. The man looked at the woman, then back to the mirror. His expression faltered. "Isn't it strange?" he asked. The reflection was wrong. Something about it didn't sit right. The glass shimmered, and for a moment it felt like the air itself had thickened. Suddenly, the woman gasped. Behind them, the sound of footsteps echoed, far too close. They spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but when they looked back at the mirror, it was there. The twisted forms of David, Sophie, and Lily. But they weren't quite themselves. Their faces were warped, grinning in that horrible, jagged smile. Their eyes hollow. The reflection shifted, the figures moving toward them, stepping out of the glass, as though the mirror was no longer a barrier. The house was hungry, and it was always waiting. The man reached for his wife, but his fingers froze midair as he felt something cold and invisible wrapped around his wrist. The shadows in the room closed in. They moved closer. The house pulsed. The door slammed shut, and the mirror, once a reflection of their own reality, now showed something else entirely. It was no longer a surface of glass. It was a mouth, a gaping, dark mouth, waiting to devour. The house opened its jaws, and the new souls, just like all the others before them, were consumed. The darkness was infinite, and when the next family arrived, they would become part of it too, because the house never stopped. It never released them. It only waited, and it always hungered. Forever. The house was a living. It never stopped, never rested, always hungry, always alive. And as the new victims, the new souls were pulled into its twisted maw, the house hummed a low, vibrating sound that resonated deep within the bones of anyone who dared to enter. The walls shifted. The very air changed. The house was changing, too. It had absorbed the essence of those before them. David, Sophie, Lily. Their souls twisted into the foundation, their voices now part of the whispering chorus that echoed through every empty room. But now it had new souls to consume, new faces to contort and break. The house moved, its hungry walls contracting and expanding, as if it was breathing. The creaking of the floors grew louder, the whispers of the lost ones more urgent. And in the distance, from behind the glass of the mirror, something stirred. A figure, a face, not quite human, not quite anything at all. It was the thing that watched, the thing that waited. The reflection shifted and twisted, contorting into something darker, something more malevolent. The glass was no longer a barrier. It was a gate, a threshold, a doorway to the endless dark. And when the next family came, when the next souls stumbled into the house, they too would become part of it. It had always been this way. It would always be this way. The house would never stop. It was always hungry, always waiting, and no one who entered would ever leave. Not in any way that mattered, for the house owned them now. It owned everyone, forever. And as the cycle began anew, the last faint trace of the family that had once lived there was erased. The house was all that was left, and it waited. It always waited. For the next, the house stood silent, its dark form looming against the night sky, a silent predator, always watching, always waiting. The windows reflected nothing but a void, and the walls whispered with the echoes of those it had claimed, those who had thought themselves safe, those who had once lived and breathed in the warmth of their homes, only to be swallowed whole by the endless darkness that lay within. Time passed, though it hardly mattered. The house existed outside of it, timeless in its hunger, eternally patient. The air around it thickened as night after night. Families came, drawn by curiosity, by desperation, by some unknowable force. But it was always the same. The door opened. The family stepped inside. They never saw the mirrors until it was too late. And the moment they touched the glass, the moment they gazed too long into the reflection, the house knew. It pulled them in, and they became part of it. The cycle began again. But one evening, something was different. The night sky was unusually still, the moon hanging heavy in the sky, like a watchful eye. The wind was still, not a leaf stirred. A car rolled slowly up the long, dark driveway, headlights cutting through the thick shadows. A young couple, nervous, excited. They had just moved into the area, eager to start a new chapter. The house had seemed perfect, spacious, quiet, out of the way. The realtor had assured them it was a steal. Too good to be true. Looks a little old, Sarah said, her voice uncertain, as she glanced at the house from the car window. James, her husband, smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. Just needs a little love, that's all, he said. A place like this has character. The car doors slammed shut. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they walked toward the front door, Sarah lingering behind for a moment, a strange sense of unease creeping up her spine. She shook it off. There was nothing to be afraid of. It was just a house. They had just arrived. They hadn't seen the mirrors yet. The door opened with a soft groan, the air inside cool and stale. James led the way, flicking on a light switch. Nothing. The house felt empty. "Hello," he called out, his voice bouncing off the walls and then disappearing into the silence. Nothing. They stepped further inside. The entryway stretched out before them, dark and shadowed, filled with the promise of secrets. "It's bigger than I expected," Sarah said, glancing around at the long hallway ahead of them. A flicker of light caught her eye. There, at the far end of the hallway, just beside the staircase, hung a large, ornate mirror. Its surface gleamed faintly in the dim light. She stared at it. Her reflection looked back, but something was off. Something wasn't right. James, oblivious, continued on. "Let's check out the kitchen," he said, his voice carrying through the house. But Sarah's feet were rooted to the floor. She couldn't take her eyes off the mirror. It was as if it was calling to her. She took a step forward, another. She was drawn to it, unable to pull away. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly. The moment her fingers brushed the cool glass, the temperature in the house dropped. A chill, a sudden weight, a feeling of wrongness, like the very air had thickened, like the house was breathing. And then she heard it, a whisper, soft at first, unintelligible. It grew louder, closer. Her heart raced, and she stumbled back. The whisper turned into a voice. A single word. Asterisk welcome. Asterisk. Sarah spun around, but no one was there. James was still down the hall, looking through the kitchen door. The house had spoken. Her breath caught in her throat. Before she could turn back to the mirror, the reflection shifted. The glass rippled like water. And for the briefest of moments, Sarah saw them. Faces, twisted, distorted. They were watching her. They were inside the glass. And then they moved. The mirror wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a gateway, a doorway to the house's hunger. The glass darkened, pulling at the edges, as if it were reaching out. She turned to scream, to run, but it was already too late. James turned at the sound of her breathless cry. "Sarah," he reached toward her, but she was already stepping toward the mirror, her body pulled forward against her will. She tried to resist, but something was dragging her in, something cold and relentless, like fingers made of ice wrapping around her waist, pulling her closer. "Asterisk, no!" Asterisk, she gasped. James lunged forward, his hand gripping her arm just as the shadows enveloped her, swallowing her whole. But as his fingers touched her skin, he froze. His own reflection was no longer his. It was a shadow, dark and jagged. A figure stepped out from the mirror behind him, Asterisk, his face distorted, hollow-eyed, grinning star. James tried to scream, but no sound came. And as the house pulled them both in, Sarah and James, their faces joining the endless throng of twisted, lost souls, the house breathed, the house fed. And somewhere in the dark, Claire's voice joined the others in the endless echo. "Asterisk, we are waiting. Asterisk." And the mirror, once again, was silent, waiting. For the next, the house stood still, its silent breath exhaling through the cracks in the walls, as though it was savoring the feast it had just consumed. Sarah and James, now lost to its endless hunger, joined the reflection, their faces twisted and contorted, absorbed into the dark mirror, becoming part of the house's eternal shadow. The hall grew quieter, the whispers fading into the walls as their souls merged with the house. Days passed, weeks, months, maybe even years. Time didn't mean anything here. The house didn't care about time. It didn't care about the world outside its walls. It only cared about the hunger, the constant gnawing hunger. The house was always patient, always hungry, and in the distance, beyond the walls, beyond the mirrors, something stirred. A new presence, a group of three, a mother, a father, and a young boy. The moment they approached the house, it stirred. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet. The windows rattled. The new family had arrived. The house sensed them. The door opened, suddenly unnaturally wide, and they stepped inside. The father, Marcus, blinked, adjusting to the sudden change in temperature. "It's colder than I thought it would be," he muttered as his wife, Grace, stepped in behind him, holding their son's hand. The boy, Ethan, looked around the large, dark foyer with wide eyes, his excitement tempered by an unnameable fear. The house felt wrong. The shadows seemed to bend around them, as if the very air shifted with every movement. "Is it haunted?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Grace laughed nervously, giving her son a reassuring squeeze. "Don't be silly, honey. It's just an old house." But even as she spoke, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The house didn't feel like just an old house. It felt alive. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in. Marcus turned to face the group. "Let's explore. It's a big place, but we'll get used to it." They stepped further inside, unaware of what lay ahead. And then, like a magnet, Ethan's gaze was drawn to something. At the end of the hall, just beyond the staircase, hung a large, ornate mirror. It was too pristine, too untouched in this otherwise decaying house. Ethan took a hesitant step forward. "Mom, Dad, look," he whispered. Grace and Marcus looked, their expressions faltering. They saw it too. The mirror's surface shimmered faintly, like the air above hot pavement, wavy, distorted. "It's beautiful," Grace murmured, though there was unease in her voice. Marcus wasn't so sure. He glanced at the mirror, his stomach tightening. Something about it felt wrong, but he didn't want to voice the thought. "What do you think, Ethan?" he asked, trying to lighten the mood. But Ethan was already walking toward it, his small fingers outstretched. "No, Ethan, wait!" Grace cried, her voice suddenly sharp with panic. She reached for him, but it was too late. The boy's hand touched the mirror, and it rippled. A soft, liquid ripple, as though the mirror was water, not glass. Ethan gasped, his body stiffened, his face blanching as his hand sank into the reflection. "Ethan," Marcus shouted, lunging forward. But the moment he grabbed his son's arm, it was like touching ice. The mirror pulled them in. All at once, the house seemed to inhale deeply, a low, vibrating hum filling the air. Grace screamed, pulling her son back, but the house didn't release its grip. The shadows in the room darkened. The reflection of the family in the mirror shifted. What they saw was not their own faces. It was them, but twisted, their eyes hollow, their smiles stretched unnaturally wide, their features grotesque and wrong. And then, the walls seemed to pulse. The air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. Grace could hardly breathe. She tried to scream, but her mouth was dry. The house was closing in on them. And then, something behind the mirror shifted. Asterisk moved star. A figure made of darkness, swirling, flickering like smoke, taking shape. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything that could be called human. It was a creature made of the house itself, a shadow, twisted into the form of the countless souls it had swallowed. Its hollow eyes met theirs through the glass, and then it smiled, a grin that stretched impossibly wide. The family was trapped. They had crossed the threshold. And in that moment, Grace realized with horror that the house wasn't simply alive. It was aware. It knew them. knew their names, their fears. It had been waiting for them. Grace reached out, trying to pull her son back, but the mirror was no longer a reflection. It was a doorway. It was hungry, and it wanted them. As Grace was pulled forward, Marcus reached out in desperation, but it was too late. The shadows consumed them all, drawing them into the reflection. The air went cold, and then silence. The house exhaled again. The door stood wide open, ready for the next. The cycle would repeat. The house always waited, and when the next came, they would join the others. Forever. And the whispers in the dark grew louder. Asterisk, we are waiting. Asterisk, the house was still. The door, once wide open, now creaked in the silence. The last traces of Grace, Marcus, and Ethan had been absorbed into the house. Their voices, their faces, twisted and distorted, became part of the reflection. Their souls, claimed and imprisoned, were now part of the endless hunger that lived within its walls. The house breathed. It inhaled, deep and slow, like a predator digesting its meal, savoring the taste of new souls. The shadows shifted, as though the house itself was settling into a new rhythm, adjusting to the latest harvest. The mirrors flickered, their surfaces rippling like water, and the voices, soft at first, began to whisper. We are waiting, and then came the sound of footsteps. New footsteps. A young woman, walking briskly up the long, dark driveway. Her name was Lily. She had been drawn to the house by a strange, insistent feeling that she couldn't shake, a pull, a whisper in her mind that told her to come. She didn't understand it, but she had followed it nonetheless. The house loomed before her now, dark and foreboding, its windows staring down like hollow eyes. She stopped, hesitated. The front door creaked open before she even reached it. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't touched the handle. She stood frozen, but the door remained open. It was like the house had been waiting for her. She stepped inside. The air was colder than she expected. The silence enveloped her, thick and suffocating. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit entryway, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. The smell of dust and decay clung to the air. But there was something else, too. Something familiar. Lily couldn't put her finger on it, but it gnawed at her. An uncanny sense of recognition. The floor creaked beneath her feet. She slowly made her way deeper into the house, drawn forward, as though some invisible force was guiding her. And then she saw it, the mirror. It stood at the end of a long hallway, gleaming in the low light, its surface smooth and clear. For a moment, Lily thought she saw a flicker. The mirror. It was calling to her. Lily reached out slowly, almost as if in a trance. Her fingertips brushed against the glass, and the moment she touched it, a shiver ran down her spine. The coldness wasn't just in the glass. It seemed to pulse through her body, freezing her in place. Then the mirror rippled. Her reflection twisted. For an instant, she saw herself, but it wasn't the Lily she knew. Her eyes were dark, hollow, her mouth stretched wide, twisted into a grin that wasn't hers. And then she saw them. Faces, their eyes hollow, their expressions twisted in agony and fear. They were pressed against the glass, their hands reaching out toward her, their bodies distorted, as if they were trapped within the mirror, waiting. She gasped, stumbling backward, but her legs were stiff, her feet glued to the floor. Asterisk, no. Asterisk, she whispered. The faces in the mirror shifted, moved closer to her. They were no longer reflections, they were real. And they were reaching out, desperate, clawing at the glass, as if they wanted to pull her in. Lily screamed, but the sound was muffled. It was as though the house had swallowed her voice. She tried to turn away, to run, but the mirror was no longer a barrier. It was a doorway. Her reflection wasn't her own anymore. It was them. Her heart pounded in her chest as her hands pressed against the glass, trying to push back, but the surface wasn't solid. It was soft, like liquid, like something alive. The cold spread through her fingers, crawling up her arms, and suddenly, the mirror pulled her in. Lily's scream echoed, but it was too late. The house had claimed her. Her form twisted, contorted, merging with the others trapped inside the glass. Her mind screamed, but it was lost in the darkness. And somewhere deep within the house, Claire's voice whispered once more, "We are waiting." The mirror shimmered, and as it settled into stillness, the reflection was once again empty. The door, still wide open, waited for the next soul. The house, always hungry, never stopped. It breathed, and it waited. The house was quiet once again. The shadows that had engulfed Lily now settled, as though it had swallowed her whole, consumed every part of her being, her soul lost within its dark, oppressive walls. The mirrors hung still, their surfaces gleaming faintly under the dim, flickering light. But within them, there were no reflections now, no distorted faces, no hollow eyes, for the house was always hungry, always waiting. A faint echo reverberated through the house, like the murmur of voices long gone. Whispers, soft and distant, but growing louder. In the hallway, the door creaked again. The house shuddered. It felt a presence. A new family, perhaps? The faintest sound of footsteps followed. A young woman, Elise, stood at the threshold of the house, a faint apprehension tugging at her chest. She hadn't expected it to look this old, this abandoned. Yet, something about it called to her. It was almost as if she had been led here, drawn by some unseen force, some whisper she couldn't escape. Her heart raced as she stepped forward, but the door opened, and before she could turn back, the house welcomed her with its cold, empty silence. There was no turning back now. Elise moved deeper into the house, her every step echoing as though the place had long been abandoned by life, yet teeming with something dark, something alive. The air felt thick, pressing against her lungs as she walked. It seemed to swallow the sound of her footfalls, muffling her presence in its hungry walls. The hallway stretched out before her, far longer than she had expected. The light flickered again, casting distorted shadows that seemed to shift, writhe, and pull at the corners of her vision. Then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway stood the mirror. It gleamed unnaturally in the dim light, its surface smooth and clear, but there was something unsettling about it. Something wrong. She felt it, deep in her gut. The way the house seemed to pulse around her, the way the shadows moved just a little too much. And then, the reflection. Elise froze. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Her reflection was wrong. Not her face. No, the figure in the glass was her, but twisted. Dark eyes, hollow and staring. Her lips pulled into a grin that wasn't hers. A chill spread across her skin, but her feet were rooted to the floor. She couldn't move, and then the reflection shifted. There were others behind her. Faces. Souls. Twisted, desperate, and hungry. Elise wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her, and the house, like an ancient beast, pulled her in. The mirror rippled. The cold air closed around her. Her vision blurred, the world spinning, as though the very fabric of reality was warping around her. She reached out, but the reflection reached back. And then, just like that, Elise was gone. The house breathed again. It had consumed another soul, another body to add to its endless collection of twisted reflections. Outside, the door hung open, a hollow invitation to anyone who might pass by. But inside it was dark, silent, and somewhere deep within its heart, the house waited. It always waited, forever. The next family would come soon enough. The house stood still, its silence thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around the empty rooms and hallways like an insidious fog. The doors remained open, an invitation that seemed innocent enough to those who didn't know. But the house knew what it was doing. It always knew. In the darkness, the walls trembled faintly, as though the house was breathing, sighing with satisfaction, content in the knowledge that its hunger had been fed once again. The souls it had claimed were now part of it, twisted, warped, and trapped forever within its cold embrace. In the distance, a car approached, its headlights cutting through the night. The soft hum of the engine grew louder, growing closer. The house didn't need to see it. It already knew. Two figures stepped out of the car, a young couple, unaware of what awaited them. They laughed nervously, arms linked, oblivious to the presence of the house that loomed over them like a dark, watchful shadow. They were here. The next meal, the next victims. But something was different this time. The house felt different. It was satisfied. The door swung open as they approached, not by their touch, but by the house's invitation. The couple glanced at one another, unsure, but curiosity and the strange pull of the house's magnetic presence pushed them forward. "Are we really going in?" the woman Mia asked, her voice laced with hesitation. "Why not?" "It's just an old house," her partner Ben answered, though his voice lacked the confidence he tried to project. He too felt it, the air heavy with something unnameable. They stepped inside. The air inside was thick, stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. Their footsteps echoed through the silence, their presence so small in comparison to the vast emptiness that surrounded them. And then there it was. At the end of the hall, a large, ornate mirror stood, gleaming faintly in the light. Ben and Mia froze, their gazes locked on the mirror. It called to them. "Ben, I don't like this." Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. There was something wrong about the mirror, something in the way it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, but Ben couldn't pull his eyes away. "It's just a mirror. There's nothing wrong with it." As they moved closer, the temperature in the room dropped. They didn't notice it at first, but the chill settled into their bones, creeping under their skin, wrapping around their hearts. Then the mirror shifted. The reflection wasn't their own. It was them. Yes, but twisted. Their faces contorted into grotesque versions of themselves. Their eyes were dark, their mouths pulled into wide, jagged smiles. Their skin pale and translucent, and behind them, the others, the lost souls, faces like blurred memories, reaching out from the glass, desperate, clawing at the surface. Mia screamed, but the sound was choked off in her throat, as though the house itself had swallowed her voice. Ben tried to pull her away, but the moment his fingers touched her arm, the mirror pulled them both in. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a gateway. The cold surrounded them, pulling them deeper into the glass. Mia and Ben struggled, but the glass didn't break. It consumed them, pulling them into the dark, cold abyss of the house's hungry maw. And in that moment, the house sighed in satisfaction. Another set of souls, twisted, trapped, and forever part of the mirror. The door, which had once been open, creaked shut. The house waited. It always waited. And far beyond its walls, in the world of the living, the search for Mia and Ben would begin. But no one would find them, not until they became part of the house. Forever. The house had no end. It was eternal. And the whispers in the dark grew louder, filling every corner, every crevice.